Tom laughed. A haunted schoolhouse? You believe that crap, Dave? Dave shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. People say strange things happen here. Kids used to tell stories about it. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the abandoned schoolhouse. It stood on a hill overlooking the village, a looming silhouette against the dying light. The building was ancient, at least a century old. Its wooden walls were rotting and overgrown with vines. The windows were dark, like empty eyes. Tom nudged Dave playfully. Come on, scaredy cat, let's see these ghosts. They walked up the weed-choked path to the schoolhouse. As they got closer, a cold breeze swept across the yard, sending shivers down their spines. The air grew heavy, filled with an eerie silence. Even the birds had stopped singing. "You sure about this, Tom?" Dave asked, his voice a nervous whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Tom just grinned and pushed open the creaking gate. The rusty hinges groaned like a scream. He pulled out his flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the peeling paint and broken windows of the schoolhouse. "See? Just an old building," Tom said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. The front door hung open, its bottom edge rotted and splintered. They stepped inside, and the smell hit them immediately. Musty, damp and tinged with something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. The air felt heavy, thick with years of silence and neglect. Dust motes danced in the beam of Tom's flashlight. The hallway stretched before them, dark and silent. Classrooms lined either side, their doors closed, hiding whatever secrets they held. The only sound was the sound of their own breathing and the pounding of their hearts. "Hello?" Tom called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no answer, but the whisper of the wind through the broken windows. Dave shivered. The place felt cold, unnaturally so. He could feel goosebumps prickling his skin. They moved deeper into the schoolhouse, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Tom swung his flashlight back and forth, the beam illuminating cobwebs and peeling paint. They passed a classroom with desks still arranged in neat rows, as if waiting for students who would never come. Then they heard it, a soft sound like a child crying. It seemed to come from down the hall, faint but unmistakable. Dave froze, his blood turning to ice. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Tom stopped, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, a low sob that sent chills down his spine. "Just the wind," he said, but his voice wavered. He didn't sound convinced, not even to himself. Section 5. Footsteps in the dark. They followed the sound of crying, their pace slow and cautious. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in around them. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. Then they heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming towards them. They echoed on the wooden floor, heavy and distinct, like the footsteps of an adult. Tom and Dave exchanged a terrified look. They were no longer alone. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. The crying stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Section 6. Confronting Fear. Tom and Dave stood frozen, listening for any sound. The silence stretched on, each second an eternity. The air felt electric, charged with unseen energy. Then they heard it again, the crying, but this time it was closer, right outside the classroom door in front of them. It was a child's cry, filled with sadness and despair. Tom slowly pushed open the door. The room was dark, illuminated only by the thin beam of his flashlight. Desks were overturned, papers scattered on the floor. In the corner, Something moved. Tom shone his flashlight on the figure. It was a young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. She was wearing a faded blue dress, her long black hair covering her face. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her small body racked with grief. "Hello?" Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. Section 7, the girl in the blue dress. The girl slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Her expression was one of pure terror. "Help me," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. Tom took a step towards her, but Dave grabbed his arm. "Don't!" he hissed, his voice filled with fear. "Something's not right." The girl looked up at them, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please," she begged, "I want to go home." Tom hesitated, torn between his compassion for the girl and the growing sense of dread that was creeping up his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Section 8, Desperate Flight. Suddenly the temperature in the room plummeted. The air grew heavy, difficult to breathe. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. "Run!" Dave screamed. He didn't need to tell Tom twice. They turned and ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could hear the girl crying behind them, her sobs growing louder, more insistent. The sound chased them down the hallway, echoing through the empty schoolhouse. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the front door and into the relative safety of the night. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling. Section 9, Lingering Dread. They lay there for a long time, too terrified to move. The night was silent now, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing. The moon had risen, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned schoolhouse. Tom looked back at the building, its dark windows seeming to watch them. He could still feel the coldness of the girl's touch, hear the desperation in her voice. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaky. Dave nodded, his face pale. He didn't need any convincing. They got to their feet and stumbled down the path, never looking back. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The terror they had experienced was a shared bond, a secret they would carry with them forever. Section 10, A Haunted Memory. They never went back to the abandoned schoolhouse. The memory of that night haunted their dreams, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked in the shadows. They never spoke of it to anyone, afraid that no one would believe them, afraid that even if they did, it would somehow make it more real. The abandoned schoolhouse remained on the hill overlooking the village, a silent sentinel to the secrets it held. And somewhere in the darkness, the crying girl in the blue dress still searched for a way home.